historical consciousness. So we reached the point where, okay, so first thing the historical consciousness did is the period called modernism, really beginning in Western Europe after the Renaissance, the period called modernism. Like historical consciousness is basically the awareness that it was the awareness that was gained between the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, that they had stepped out of one form of social organization and into another form of social organization. And then further, it was the awareness that over time, human societies change patterns of social organization, and they change in scale and they change in complexity. And the thought is that the changes in scale and complexity generally denote advancement. So the larger scale, more complex society was deemed to be the more advanced society, the better society. And so then the historical consciousness that developed in Western Europe and continued to grow until the middle 20th century, or really until now, went back and looked back at former times, and it reinterpreted former times, his former human cultural patterns of organization. And it basically saw a growth process, a progress. And that growth process became its measure and its way to basically hierarchize different human societies. So the historical consciousness basically said that what it is that separated modern and pre-modern, one way you could look at it is that the pre-modern relied on metaphysics. It relied on speculative ideas about where humanity originated and what was the best thing for us to do with life and what happened after death, and how everything was created, not just humanity, but the cosmos. And that the discovery of the scientific method basically allowed human beings to find the real causes of how the earth had developed, how humanity had developed, and gain real control over the environment. And so instead of saying a pattern of organization was ordained by God or the gods, you could say that a pattern of organization was created by the best of human knowledge at that time. And as human knowledge progressed, patterns of organization would progress too. And so that's the modern, is the historical consciousness, and then pre-modern is I'm just going to generally call the metaphysical consciousness. And then prehistoric, you might say, is indigenous. And I'm saying this from the Western viewpoint of historical consciousness. I'm not saying this is necessarily what I believe. So now I think what's happening in the postmodern is, because part of the project of the modern was to try to unite all of these different human cultures under reason, and to, from one perspective, it was to try to enlighten the rest of the world, and from another perspective, it was to try to conquer the rest of the world and exploit their resources, or exploit the peoples themselves as resources. So I think the postmodern term comes from a couple of different places. First of all, it comes from within the Western tradition, an experience with the limitations of reason. And I think that sense of the limitations of reason really gained strength after the Second World War, where people saw the use of the atomic bomb, and they saw Germany, which was one of the most rational and advanced countries, act in ways that they ascribed to pre-modern peoples and times. And act with those ways with the technology of a modern historical rational consciousness. So it wreaked that much more havoc. And so I think a lot of questions started to rise within the Western world about the limits of reason. And are human beings fundamentally reasonable? Can they be made reasonable? How flexible is the human being? And even questions about what human nature, is there such a thing as human nature? Is reason part of our nature in the first place? Another way that the postmodern, I think, came about is a sort of recognition that there are other ways of knowing. And that if you engage in other ways of knowing, you might actually be able to produce other types of results or other types of relating to the world. So one question is are other societies that are not modern more primitive, less complex, less developed, or are they operating according to other ways of knowing? I think another one that happens is when we talk about historical consciousness, we also talk about the fact that we only can reconstruct histories as far as we have records for them. And so the narrative of history is really about the narrative of peoples that kept certain types of records. And the assumption is that the peoples that didn't keep certain types of records lived in certain types of very simple societies that didn't have the technology for records, but also didn't have, like, the way that they lived, you can still see examples of those ways of living now. And so therefore, you don't actually need the records. You can just kind of study the cultural patterns and see that these sort of primal societies or indigenous societies didn't change much and that this is a way of life that human beings have been living for centuries. Okay, because where I was originally trying to go was to this idea. I was basically trying to say, I'm gonna give you a linear narrative and then I'm gonna explode the narrative. Okay. And the explosion is more powerful if you go on the line first. So another piece of the postmodern came out with this idea that there were the facts, but then there's also how the facts are applied and how they're interpreted. And that the interpretation of fact changes based off of who is interpreting. And basically different groups will interpret the facts to suit their needs and to reflect, and this is more accidentally, I think, although sometimes not, to reflect their own biases. So, this kind of gets you into the Marxian view of ideology, which is basically saying people are interpreting historical fact and they're using technologies to benefit their own position in society or to enhance their own position in society. And that sometimes people do things to benefit their own position in society and interpret facts and interpret history out of a blindness. I wish I had a better term for it, but out of a inability to perceive otherwise. But that they oftentimes do interpret things when they know otherwise, but they distort the facts and they narrow their vision so that they don't have to deal with the otherwise, because the otherwise would challenge their position in society. And that's, I think, part of the Marxist definition of ideology. That's when you are doing things ideologically. You are purposely distorting your perception You're limiting your perception of the world because you don't want new information to destroy your comfort, your psychological comfort in your position in society. And so that ideological view about history and fact and progress, and even what we choose to turn attention to investigate, right? Because whatever gets research dollars has a better chance of being discovered, tested, and verified as science, as fact, as information. It doesn't mean, I'm not trying to say that the only reason we have the facts, the body of facts that we have now is because we've done tests for them. And if we were to test for other things, totally new things would come up. I'm not trying to say that, but there is a degree to which science is governed by which kinds of experiments get funding and which kind of experiments get access to the tools of research. So then there's this idea that knowledge is ideological and knowledge is at the behest of power. And also knowledge supports and increases power to a certain extent. And that power is basically about human desire. You know, it's about what a group of people wants to keep, wants to retain, wants to protect themselves from. So then you have these different competing schools that can take the same fact and interpret the same fact in different ways. Okay? And we see this in our times very strongly. Like, we have weather, okay? And when you look out and you see these tropical storms, you see these wildfires, you see these famines, and one group of people will say, this is based off of the fact that human beings are emitting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, and it's creating instability in the climate. And another group of people says, this is based off the fact that there is a God who is angry at the behavior of human beings and is starting to introduce chaos into the world as a warning, right? And it's the same information, it's the same stimulus, but it's being interpreted in two different ways. Now, the scientific community is saying, we've developed these tools of investigation, and if you don't apply these tools of investigation, there's no way you're going to come up with real knowledge. And that this is the pre-modern view of the same perception of information. But then you have, even within the scientific community, you have the debate about whether climate is real or not. And now most people say that the climate debate is actually not a debate, and that most scientists believe that climate science is verifiable and it's the best science, and that the doubters are not really, they're few and far between, and they don't have their hands on the best science. But the doubters claim, well, you have an agenda and you're being funded in certain ways to produce certain types of information. And actually, and I'm talking about within the realm of science, and actually the mainstream scientists are saying the same thing. They're saying, oh, well, you're getting your research money from oil, so you have an interest in not producing the right kinds of facts. So, you know, and there are other debates within the scientific field that are maybe a little bit more legitimate to people, or to people who are coming from the scientific perspective. But that's just one example. And so now we have this time where we can't even agree on what facts are. And maybe we never could. Maybe that consensus of what the fact is was always basically inside of the scientific community, and other people's were pre-modern or non-modern, okay? So what the postmodern is basically saying is that the scientific community is one community of knowledge amongst a world of many types of knowledge, of many ways of pursuing knowledge. And I'm just using knowledge. There's a lot of different ways we could talk about this. Or that the scientific community is saying, no, we actually have the most reliable methodology for finding fact and then developing tools that allow us to control our environment and make our environment as predictable as possible. And the postmodern is basically saying, hey, look, that desire to make the environment as predictable as possible is a desire for control and power. So science is still a power-based enterprise. And its vision that it has the best form of knowledge and that everybody around the world should basically take on this form of knowledge, learn it, and then verify for themselves. It's actually an extension. It's not necessarily an extension. It depends on your view, but it actually has a lot of the same kind of proselytizing tendencies as some of the monotheistic religions, or the same type of conquest orientation as a lot of the colonial enterprises of the last several hundred years that came out of Western Europe and co-evolved with the scientific enterprise. And some people would say we're very successful because of the new tools and weapons that were created through the empirical sciences. So the postmodern turn is basically to say science is another power enterprise, and it has its biases and its distortions and its refusal to see and incorporate certain types of information because it is invested in trying to spread its way of doing things from a center outward. And it's in competition with all these other forms of power, these other bodies of knowing and power, right? And so, you have certain things in the scientific community that are out of the question, okay? Like, let's take this guy, Rupert Sheldrake. Maybe you've heard of him. He did a TED Talk a few years ago, and he has this theory of morphic resonance or morphogenic fields. And he's basically positing that biological entities, species, that there is a non-physical field of information that species experience gets deposited into, and that individuals in that species all contribute to it, and that at certain moments they can actually feed into that field and learn things and change behavior. And so that talk was initially banned by the TED organization because they thought it was pseudoscience. Oh. So I mean, but if we're supposed to be able to have an environment of free debate, and Rupert Sheldrake claims to be a trained scientist, he's also, I think, a member of the Anglican Church. He's a trained biologist. If TED is supposed to be a place where ideas can flourish and rub up against each other, why ban his talk? Right? So the postmodern view is that you banned his talk because you're ideological. And science has an ideological bias, and it doesn't want to allow information that might contradict its body of thinking to come into it. So the postmodern turn, again, is saying that there are all these kind of competing human organizations that are power-based, or that have their own ways of discovering knowledge, or they are their own language games. These aren't my terms. I think this is who is it? I heard it from Sassauer, getting his first name. You can kind of put these things. I don't think it was even him. Language games. Who was that? I don't know if it was Lacan, whatever. I'm hazy on a lot of this stuff, but whatever. It's just conversation. Anyway, they have these different language games, and these language games are limited frames of reference within themselves, and they condition how information or how stimuli comes into them, and they organize stimuli according to their own existing language games. I'm gonna go get some battery power right now. Okay, so language games. All right, so not only does different language games condition the kind of stimuli that comes into them, they also sometimes are untranslatable to one another. And that's where you get this kind of story in the postmodern of like the Tower of Babel. It's like the reason was thought to be this one, this code that could translate all other forms of code into itself or destroy them and replace them, show them to be false. And then so they got to a point where they're saying, actually, all these codes, like reason is a code amongst many, and even within the family of reason, there are all these kind of different competing interests for that code. But then there are these other kind of codes, there's other sort of language games, there's these other disciplines. And in some respects, they are translatable into one another, but in some respects, they're not. And not only is there the logics of them untranslatable to one another, but the groups of people themselves often are hostile to one another. They don't actually want to translate into between one another because they kind of want to retain their little basis of power. And you see this a lot in the universities, but you see it all over. You see it in community organizations. You see it in the business world. We're kind of all entered into this state of competition. It's capitalist, right? It's like whoever has any kind of exclusive anything is trying to keep it exclusive to a certain extent, and so that they can sell it to people in limited quantities. So that's kind of part of the postmodern turn. And now what you see too, which is really interesting, and I personally find it to be troubling, is that the postmodern came out of it has a lot of different sources, but one source and the source that I talked about is the Marxists, which would be viewed as the political left. But now you can see actually that the political right, the cultural right, has kind of caught up to the Marxist type of stuff, the ideological perspective. And they're basically now in this game they're kind of playing the postmodern game too. They're playing identity politics. And they are playing, the whole fake news phenomenon, right? Fake news is basically saying you can't trust CNN or Fox or whatever your source is, because whatever the source is, they have a bias, and they're going to interpret the facts to favor their bias. And then it gets really deep when you have people who are still, and this is just within the Western world, I'm not even talking about Africa, I'm not talking about, indigenous peoples in South America and in Africa and North America, I'm not talking about China, I'm not talking about the Middle East per se, although there's what we call modern in all of those places. But just in the United States, in the Western world, you have people who reject a lot of the fundamental findings of science, such as the fact that, but according to some people, it's not even a fact, that the earth is round. There are people that reject the spherical nature of the earth and say the earth is flat. So we have within our own society, we can't even agree on the basic morphology of the planet that we live on, or that it's even a planet. So it gets really difficult because in a society, in a democratic society, you have to make decisions together. Ultimately, you have to make decisions together, and be able to make decisions. The idea of modernism is that you have to have an informed public, a scientifically literate public, that when certain information came down the line or facts came down the line, the public knew how to interpret those facts correctly, arrive at the correct conclusions, and basically vote for the policy choices that were put before them by their elected leaders, who are also supposed to be scientifically trained and literate. So if people don't agree about the basic facts of what is, then how can they even come to making the same decisions, because they're not even basically inhabiting the same world. They're living in different language games. And so now you got that kind of thing going on, and you got this idea that different purveyors of information are ideological and biased, and that they spin the news to make it favor their narrative. And so it's all these competing narratives now. And that's kind of where the postmodern is. It's all these competing narratives. And then you got the conspiracy theory people, right, who believe that, okay, here's another piece that I didn't really address. So part of the idea of historical progression is that different groups of people, a society gets larger and it gets more complex. And that's how we rate what is a more advanced society or not. It's larger, it's more complex, and in its complexity, it can provide a higher standard of living for people, okay? So how is it that we store information? Okay, like you go look at like a Marshall McLuhan. Okay, the first way that we store information as human beings is through words. It's through spoken language, and spoken language, because of its medium, it can capture perception in a certain way, and it distorts perception in another way. Then what do we got from spoken language? From spoken language, you got written language. You got hieroglyphs, you got pictographs, you got ideograms, and then you got the phonetic language, okay? Then from the phonetic language, this is McLuhan's theory, you go from phonetic print language to standardized in movable print and movable type. And so you can mass produce information. And he says that was actually one of the things that was responsible for the Renaissance, which is the point at which I started off kind of saying that the Renaissance was the point at which the modern was born. The rational was born, and people developed a point of view that was non-metaphysical, okay? And now we have an electronic environment, okay? And the electronic is deeper now than it was when McLuhan was writing. It's way deeper. It's way deeper. You have the internet and you have social media. You have this, and you have mobile data. You have the ability to access this collective bank of information at any point in time, and you have users who can upload and share information from a lot of different points. And there's no one that's policing the users. So it's a free-for-all, and everybody can say whatever it is that they want to say, like I'm doing now. And so then there's no standard on the quality. There's no quality control. So anyone can say anything. And then the algorithms, the way that they're set out, is they basically just repeat what you've already done, and they kind of find things that you might like based off of, words that reoccur in your, when you translate all those words into code, they reoccur. These certain words will reoccur in this code, and then they look at the words that you use, and then what other words they might be connected to, and what other codes they might be connected to, and then they say, okay, if this person likes these words to translate into these codes, then they'll probably also like these codes to translate into these words. And so the algorithm just repeats itself. It snowballs every now and again and pulls in a new possibility, but basically just goes over and over. So you get trapped hearing about and reading about the same things and seeing the same things and getting the same kinds of ads. So that's the echo chamber effect, which further enhances this postmodern shattering of everybody out, no one language, and then these kind of competing games. And these games that are untranslatable into one another. And so then you got all these different worlds, okay? And if you got different worlds, if you got people that believe in a flat earth and that the earth is 6,000 years old, and if people that believe that the earth is 1 billion years old, and people that believe that the earth is actually floating on the back of a cosmic turtle, and they're all existing in the same place and actually all using the internet, many of them, you got our current situation. And you got people that are going to construct different timelines for how history unfolds. And then what we tend to do the Sankofa thing. Sankofa is a Ghanaian symbol that a lot of Black people in the United States and in the African diaspora have brought to our field to talk about when you reach back into the past to pick up something from the past to bring it forth into the future or give you fuel to go into the future. So every society or a lot of societies, I think, will project their vision of the past into the future. Right? So what does the mainstream scientific vision of the future look like? It looks like bigger buildings, bigger ships, bigger weapons, and more mechanization. That's what it looks like, because that's what it's done. And that's the way that it rates human progress, is bigger and more complex, okay? So that's typically what they picture. Now you're just starting to get people that are going into the whole idea of miniaturization, because now advanced technology is not just moving towards bigger, it's also microfying, right? It's miniaturizing, okay? And this is kind of Afrofuturist thinking, is what if a different society that had a different view of the past and therefore of the future in the present how would they relate to these tools? And what kind of future would they project? So now we're at a place where I said I wanted to build a line and then explode it. And I think we're at a place where you can see the Western linear vision of progressive development of complexity. And then now the complexity has reached a point where it has exploded, and we're at a place where it actually is starting to break down and become unintelligible to itself. And so instead of having one timeline and one ruler to measure history and interpret human actions, we have all these different rulers. We got rulers, I don't even know how to make sense of it, honestly. But we have all these different interpretive frameworks for how to interpret not just a mini department of the world, but the world itself. We have many worlds now. But then this is where I kind of get back to, we have many worlds, but we still only have one Earth. Okay? And here's the facts that I don't think can be disputed by anybody. You need to eat. You got to eat, or you will die. What is death? We don't know. All we know is that the body disappears. The way that the body is constituted, it falls on the ground and it gets decomposed. And that living, breathing, speaking, perceiving entity that you thought was you is gone. And that creatures, humans included, tend to try to avoid going back into the soil. So we all are eating. We have that shared reality of the need for food. And why do I ask this? Well, what's so important about the food and the shared earth thing? My thing is that I think that it's important, actually, that the ideological bases of knowledge are exposed. Okay, let me jump back before I get there. The other thing I wanted to say about information and everybody being in their own silos is this. As creatures, we rely on our senses to interpret the stimuli of the universe into something that's usable for us as humans. Now, people ask the question, is the blue sky really blue? Is your blue my blue? Or when I say blue, I see one thing, and then you say blue, but you see the color of this shirt. Okay, and then I think this is structuralism or post-structuralism. That view is that it doesn't matter what the sky actually is. What it matters is that we make an agreement. Like if I say the sky is blue, or if I say point to something blue, and you point to the sky, and I point to the sky because it's blue, and we both agree that sound blue is blue, then that works. Then what we need is shared language that basically gives us behavior that we agree upon, coordinated behavior. And the thing in of itself is not actually something that can be known. All we can know as human beings is that we have shared signals that we send to one another that coordinate our behavior. So then the whole quest for objective knowledge of the universe becomes less relevant, because it's really about creating shared frames of reference and language. And that's why when frames of reference and language do not communicate with one another, or their bases or the ways that they seek information are so different that they're incompatible, that's when we have a problem, you might say. Although the postmodern says, well, maybe there's just all these different entities that are out there, and we shouldn't try to bring them under something universal. So then, but then the question is then how do you run a nation? How do you run a democratic society on mutually unintelligible language games? And there are some people that even say, hey, the nation state was a product of the linear period of history and it's about to break down. But now, and so getting back to what I was trying to say about food is I think it was important to expose the ideological basis of science and other human endeavors, and the fact that those bases are controlled to a certain extent by people seeking power. I think it was important to make a distinction between the thing in and of itself and how we perceive and conceptualize things. Okay? But to an extent, it's kind of irrelevant whether or not the thing in and of itself actually exists. You know, people say, does a rainbow exist or not? It wouldn't exist without the human eye. It's kind of like that which does not exist beyond the senses maybe it isn't relevant. And I think that was the move of science. But I'm going to flip this. There are other people that say that actually there are other senses that we can develop as human beings. There's some people that say we have a magnetic sense. We can sense electrical fields. Or let's just use the example of color blindness. There are people that say some people don't perceive certain colors. So if our field of perception expands, then potentially there are dimensions of the world that are invisible to us or non-perceptible to us now that will be perceptible if your senses expand. Okay? And so on the one hand, I'm saying if the rainbow doesn't exist without the eye, then we don't need to worry about what is beyond our senses. And on the other hand, I'm saying if our senses were other than they are, or if they expand, then we could perceive things that we don't perceive. There could be dimensions of the world that we don't perceive. And so I think the ideological exposure of science was important, but I also think that what we call this, is it epistemological or is it ontological? I'm not sure. Or is it phenomenological? Okay. But if we had senses that were other than what we have, we could perceive more worlds. Now, there are cultures and people that claim to be able to perceive things that other people can't perceive. Now, you might first of all say, well, why should we believe them? You could just be lying to make yourself feel special and to be special in the eyes of others. You know, but there are people that are colorblind. There are people that are blind. There are people that can't hear. There are people that have synesthesia and all of their sensory modalities are firing off at once. You know, who knows? That might be the future of the human nervous system organization. It might be synesthetic. Imagine what kind of society we would create, what kinds of technologies we would create if we were all synesthetics. Now, some people say the brain can't handle it, it's too much information. Okay, maybe that's just right now. Give it 1,000 years, 150,000 years. I don't know. I'm just saying, I'm just putting it out there as a thought experiment. What kind of society would we create if we were synesthetics? What would we do with this towel? If every time I touch this towel, I got colors? What kind of language would develop? What kind of language would develop if every time I said words, I went word, and then you saw a flash of green? And in certain states of consciousness, which can be induced artificially or through some type of symbiosis between you and plant forms, if you want to go there, you can perceive these things. So there are peoples and groups and individuals that claim to have perceived other than the world that our five senses usually disclose to us. And so I think it was important to basically expose science and say, hey, look, there could be more than the world that we know. Okay? So there could be higher dimensions or invisible dimensions of reality that we are interacting with, but we just don't perceive. Like one day I was looking outside and I watched the wind blow over some trees and I couldn't hear the wind and I just saw it. And I was like, if I didn't know that and I saw a couple of trees swaying, if I didn't know that there was a wind that would hit all those trees, because basically all the trees are inside of the air, I would think that maybe underneath the roots of those trees, if they all moved at once, there was some kind of joined root that was moving them. Like there was a body, like a trunk, moving them. I wouldn't know that there was air. And there might be elements in reality where we're all being affected by a wave, but we are trying to tie together the individual figures and say that those individual figures are all coordinated because they're all getting a message instead of them all being affected by some common wave or being part of a larger environment that they actually can't perceive. Okay? So I'm putting the other states of consciousness, other forms of knowledge, other epistemologies that reveal other ontologies over here. And on the other hand, I want to also look at the fact that our senses give us what our experience of the world is, okay? And science is first based off of sensory observation and observing the regularity of the world, and then trying to make predictions about what was going to happen next, and then setting up controlled environments where you can make phenomenon do certain things and then try to recreate what they do over and over to the point where you can predict them outside of that limited space that you create, right? The limited space is the experiment, and the prediction outside of that is the applied tech. So now science has gotten so abstract, it's based off of equations, it's based off of signal patterns, code patterns that represent phenomenon in the real world. It's gotten microscopic. We're not even talking about atoms or bacteria. We're talking about quantums, things that actually flash in and out of existence anyway. It's so astronomical. It's out in outer space. It's black holes. It's stuff that we can't even really see. It's just that we see certain signals moving out there, and then we basically reconstruct what that thing could be based off of what those signals do. And then we've got these things, And now we're storing all the data that we're finding from science, not just science, but pretty much everything, recording everything like I'm doing now, and we're storing it on these devices. So what you have is, and then you have science has built up this huge literature of what is real based off of these different equations and experiments about what is real. But the average person does not have the training. And even in the scientific community, there's nobody that can individually verify that everything that the body of science says is true is true. No one can do it. It's too much information. It's a dispersed thing. It has to live in the internet global brain. It has to live amongst generations of trained community scientists. So nobody can do that, okay? No one person can verify that it's all true. Everybody has to rely and basically trust the piece of the method that they know and that they understand to say that the rest of it is true, reasonably. And so no one person can verify it, that all those experiments work, and no one person can, with their senses, verify, for example, that the Earth is round. Although I think if you get up in a plane, you can see the curvature of the Earth. Okay, so then and then let's go to the realm of fiction. Let's go to the realm of fantasy. Let's go to the fact that when I was a kid, I watched Superman 2, and they had a scene on the moon where the Superman and the three villains from Krypton showed up. The three villains grabbed the astronaut on the moon, threw him out in space, and it looked like they were on the moon. So then people see that and they say, well, what leads you to believe that Hollywood didn't just fake the moon landing and it's actually not just a movie? And so now we're in this realm where everything that comes through these screens could be recreated, simulated, deep faked, all this stuff. And so if most of our world is coming through the screen, we don't know if it's been messed with and doctored with to create a certain story to make us think a certain thing. And we can't verify all the truths of science with our senses. So we're in this place where if you want to follow the linear line of science, it's shattering. I'm not even talking about other modes of perception. I'm just talking about the linear mode of science. It's shattering, kind of. And it makes it hard to create a shared society if there's not a shared language and view and vision of the world, how it works and what it's supposed to do, and what we're supposed to do in it. But this is the thing that we do all share. We all share the need to eat. And the whole of economics is just an outgrowth of the fact that we have to eat. And even though we might say, oh, I believe the earth was 6,000 years old, and somebody else says, I believe that it is 1 billion years old, and somebody else says, I believe that this is actually all an illusion, and none of this is even happening, all of those people are eating. So we can have as many different visions in the world as we want, but we all still share the fact that we have to eat and that we are rooted to one earth. And the one earth can bloom many worlds, but it is still one earth. So how do we, because again, I think it was important that the scientific linear thing be opened and exposed as a power game. Because this idea that the rational Western society is in every respect superior to every other society that preceded it and that still exists, I think is arrogant. And through its own way of thinking has showed itself to be on shaky ground. Not false, but on a shaky ground. So I think that was important. And at the same time, I think the loss of a unified language and the loss of a unified method to demonstrate what is real and what is not, and what we can work with and what is not, has led us to this place where anyone can say anything. And if it feels like it suits what you already believe, you will join it and jump on it. So I don't really know what the end of this situation is, but I know we are in a place where, at least in the United States, where everybody thinks that they don't know who to believe, who to trust, what to believe. And we're in this totally kind of conspiratorial, detached, floating situation, virtual reality. And God help us if these things get strapped to our faces and eyes. And then you can't even trust your own senses. I think one thing that we could do to get back is actually get back into our senses. I think we can talk to real people, flesh and blood in 3D, which is hard during this COVID moment, makes this whole thing even weirder. Because if this becomes the permanent way of life, then everything that comes through this screen could be doctored. And if it gets strapped to your face, well, we're in real trouble. Or if it goes in your brain, I think we're in real trouble. So I think one thing we can do is continue to come back to our senses. And another thing I think we can do through paying attention to our senses, we can actually sharpen our senses and heighten our senses. And I think in those heightened spaces of sensory heightened spaces, there are textures of reality that don't come through when your senses are dull. Now, as to the full-on reality of those and as to their architecture, I cannot say. And that's where I think people go too far with metaphysics. You have a paranormal experience and you think you can map the whole thing out. I don't think we can do that yet. I can't honestly say I can do that. But I think there are some of these things that are out there, and I think they need to come in and meet this linear, scientific, structured way of organizing the world and help it expand. And they might even be able to help us knit together these fragmented, different language games that are in competition with one another and mutually unintelligible. That sensory perceptiveness, and then also the shared fact that we need to eat and that we are basically mortal or a vanishing phenomenon. And when we vanish, because the human ego has a sense of coherence, when it becomes incoherent, we have to ask, where does it go? That's the oldest, that's metaphysics, that's pre-science. And that's the question that science still can't answer, is what happens to the experience, the phenomenon of consciousness when you die? Does it end altogether? And they want to say yes, but they can't really say yes because consciousness is a from the inside out experience. Which, and this is where I disagree with postmodernists, it's pre-verbal. Babies have consciousness and they don't deal with language. So where does that consciousness go? We can't say. But because we have an experience of coherence of consciousness, we are curious what happens. And that consciousness can shift. You have dream consciousness. You have drug consciousness, psychedelic consciousness, whatever. You have meditative consciousness. You have arousal. It can shift. And so we wonder what happens, right? So we have mortality, we have the need to eat, and we have our senses, which we can refine or dull. And I think we're going to need all three of those prongs of reality, of shared, to navigate this environment that we've created around ourselves that can show us more and more. It's going to be able to show us whatever we want to see, regardless of its reality. All right, I think that's it.